Hi, I'm Brooke Riemann, and this is my presentation on understanding students with ADHD. This is one of my favorite topics that we've had so far in this class because I think it's really relevant to our world and our society today. We have so many students who have a diagnosis of ADHD or they show the characteristics of it, and it's just something you hear about a lot, TV and in the news. It's a really big deal nowadays. So my first slide, what is ADHD exactly? So first of all, it stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. It's a mental disorder. It's usually identified in children, usually like around first grade or so is when the referral or the diagnosis is sometimes made. It interferes with the child's ability to concentrate, their ability to sit still, remember information, pay attention to details. They have a difficult time trying to recall information, a lot of things. It's a lot more than just those, but those are a few of the symptoms. About 7% of children in the United States are identified today as having ADHD. And also I found that boys are about 3 times more likely to have ADHD than girls, which is kind of interesting. So in this class we talk a lot about IDEA and how they define things, and according to IDEA, students with ADHD fall under a subcategory of other health impairments. So it actually does not have its own category. ADHD makes up about 2/3 of the students who are in this subcategory. And due to the fact that IDEA does not have its own definition of ADHD, most professionals or doctors refer to the DSM-5 criteria for determining whether or not a student has ADHD. So the criteria for ADHD, this is kind of a little bit of a breakdown of it. ADHD, of course, has a multitude of symptoms. I think one of the resources I found says it can have, I think, up to 18 different symptoms. Not all of the symptoms are always present in a child or a person who has the disorder. They may have just a few of them. They could have all of them. It just really varies from one person to the next. In order to be determined ADHD, the symptoms must be, this is from the textbook, it says they must be persistent, frequent, and severe. So that's what's really important to remember for determining an actual diagnosis of ADHD. So, like I said, thinking about some of the symptoms, unable to sit still and unable to focus or concentrate, a lot of students have that. It's not something that's unusual. And a lot of people even have, I know I have trouble trying to remember things sometimes or trying to focus, and it doesn't mean that I have ADHD. It doesn't mean that all students have ADHD. What really makes it different and determining that diagnosis is it's persistent, it's frequent, it's severe, and it's to the extent that it really affects their ability to perform well in the classroom. It interferes with their ability to learn and to succeed in a classroom setting or in social settings even. So in determining a diagnosis for a student, the symptoms must interfere with the student's development or ability to function in settings such as the classroom. The DSM-5 breaks down ADHD into 3 subtypes. And here are the 3. The first is predominantly inattentive type, and this means that the student is easily distracted and has difficulty paying attention. They're easily off task. They have a lot of trouble trying to stay focused on directions that the teacher is giving or any assignment that the teacher might give. The second is predominantly hyperactive or impulsive type. This means that the student typically has trouble sitting still, keeping his hands to himself, keeping his feet still, staying seated. He probably talks excessively, blurts out answers before the teacher even asks for an answer, things like that. And the third is called the combined type. And I found that this is actually the most common type. And this type applies to students who show characteristics of both of the previously mentioned subtypes. So the combined type means that they've got the inattentive part, they have trouble paying attention, they're distracted, they're easily off task, and then they have that hyperactiveness too, where they can't sit still, they can't keep their hands to themselves, they're constantly just wiggling and wanting to move around, all of those kind of things. So the third type is the most common. The causes of ADHD, which is something that I found really interesting because I never really knew what the causes actually are. So according to a lot of research, ADHD has 3 possible causes. Heredity is one, and that seems to kind of be the major one. Structural differences in the brain can be another one, and environmental causes is the third. Research shows that heredity is likely to be a major cause of ADHD. So a child who has an immediate family member, like a parent or a sibling with the disorder, they are likely to be diagnosed with ADHD as well at some point in their life. Significant differences in brain size and shape have been documented in people with ADHD, which is something that I found really interesting. I had never heard that before. And there's also environmental causes, and this can be prenatal factors such as being exposed to cigarette smoke. I think lead and alcohol were a couple of the other ones. It could be things that happen after birth also, but environmental causes is probably the least likely cause. It's got the least amount of research to back it up, is what I found. So it's a lot more likely to be heredity or differences in the brain. So how has the number of students identified increased in recent years? It's actually made huge increases in the last several decades. And according to our textbook, rates have increased 30% since the late 1990s. One of my online sources that I found, I think, said that it's increased about 40% just in the last 8 years. So there's different information out there. I went with what the textbook said, but in any case, it's definitely on the rise rapidly. More than 6 million American children who are between the ages of 4 to 17 have a diagnosis of ADHD, according to one of my online sources. I found that to be really shocking. That's just an amazing statistic. What's the reason behind this trend? So it's on the rise. You hear these diagnosis reports being made more and more. Many experts believe that children are often misdiagnosed as ADHD, which I certainly think is probably likely. Some doctors are too quick to label a child with this diagnosis is some of the information that I found. For a diagnosis to be fair and accurate, many factors need to be considered, and an adequate amount of time must be spent analyzing the behaviors of the child. So, like I say, I do think that this diagnosis gets thrown out there way too often. I think a lot of times doctors or even teachers, they see a kid who has some of these characteristics and they just automatically say, oh, he's probably got ADHD and let's get him on some meds and let's try to fix this. And the statistics on the medication is something that I was really surprised and also really just interested by. It's shocking the number of kids who are on medications like Adderall and things like that, these serious drugs, and even when they're 3 or 4 years old, they're being prescribed all these anxiety drugs or things to help control ADHD, and it's just mind-blowing. What behaviors should you expect to see in students with ADHD? So if you're a teacher, there's different symptoms that you might notice in students. If you know for sure a student has ADHD, you're likely to see things like inattentiveness, a lack of focus, fidgeting, being wiggly, unable to sit still, excessive talking. Those are just a few things you might see. Students with ADHD often have trouble finishing assignments and may require more time than others to complete an assignment or a test. And this is something that our textbook talked about, and you're really not giving that student an extra advantage over other students, which, some people might be quick to think, but you're really just trying to help them to do their best. As a teacher, you want each of your students to do their best, and so there's going to be times where you need to make accommodations for students, and certainly those with ADHD are going to need a lot of accommodations in the classroom. So giving them a little extra time to finish an assignment or a test could certainly be an accommodation. They struggle more than their peers to learn and perform well in school. They're usually unable to be organized or to plan ahead. They often have lower vocabulary development and memory problems. I thought that was kind of interesting too. Is ADHD the same in every child? Based on the research I found, no, it is not. They don't always have the same symptoms, and one student might have a lot more symptoms than another student. So remember that ADHD has 3 subtypes. They might have the inattentive type. They might have the more hyper type. They could have just one of those, or it could be the combined type, which means that they show characteristics of both. And I found that symptoms for boys are a lot different than girls also. Boys are more likely to show externalized symptoms, which is like the physical aggression, acting out, maybe being kind of violent. Girls are more likely to be kind of the opposite, kind of withdrawn and inattentive, and kind of depressed, different things like that. So there's different symptoms to look for in boys versus girls too. So some class-wide interventions teachers could use. First of all, think about the setup of the classroom. Students with ADHD are easily distracted, so if I have a student and I know that he has ADHD, I probably will not sit him right by the window because he's going to look out the window and get distracted by cars or, if there's people outside. Noise and lighting can be very distracting for certain students, so you'll want to take that into consideration. One resource I found talked about scheduling, and I thought that was interesting. I hadn't really thought about that, but they're a lot more likely to be off task in the afternoon. So take advantage of the morning time and do a lot of your instruction and things like that in the morning when they're maybe a little more focused. And then the afternoon could be kind of more broken up and maybe have some movement kind of activities. You can do things to increase the interest and motivation of your students when presenting materials. The use of colors, shapes, textures, just however you present your material, try to do it in a way that's a little more fun and stimulating to the student. Having visual cues around the room that remind students of rules and appropriate behaviors is definitely important. These should be reinforced frequently. You should refer back to them and remind students of these things because they're likely to forget. And provide physical movement whenever possible. And I mentioned brain breaks are essential for all students, and this could be as simple as doing a Go Noodle video. That's something that a lot of teachers at the school I work at use, and I love it. Go Noodle is such a great resource, and there's all kinds of fun videos and activities and things on there that students can do. And I love that. I definitely want to use that as a teacher. I'll try to get through this quickly. I'm about out of time. Teachers need to remember to just educate yourself as much as possible about your students, especially those with ADHD. They're going to require a lot of your time and your energy. You need to be flexible with your schedule. You need to realize that students are sometimes going to have these days where they just can't sit still and they can't stay focused. So be prepared to kind of switch up your plans a little bit. And my last slide is my reference list. I mostly use the textbook, but I also had a few websites